What if I told you that the most important design decision in smartphone history was also the most controversial one, and that when Apple finally reversed course, millions of people quietly mourned something they couldn't even name? Today, we are going back to a moment that most people have completely forgotten about, and I genuinely think understanding it will change how you see every app on your phone right now. Let me paint you a picture. The year is 2007. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in San Francisco and pulls a small rectangle from his pocket. No buttons, no stylus, just glass, and the crowd goes absolutely insane. But here is the thing that nobody talks about enough. The hardware was revolutionary. Sure, the glass, the touchscreen, the sensor array, all of that was genuinely mind-blowing. But what actually made the iPhone work? What made regular people pick it up and understand it within seconds was not the hardware at all. It was a design philosophy buried inside the software, a philosophy so deliberate, so carefully considered, that its absence today tells us something uncomfortable about where technology has gone. That philosophy had a name, skeuomorphism, and most people have never heard of it, even though it shaped the first decade of the smartphone era and fundamentally changed how billions of people learn to live digital lives. So what actually is skeuomorphism? The word sounds like it belongs in an architecture lecture, and honestly, in a way it does. It comes from the Greek word skeuos, meaning tool or container, and morphe, meaning shape. In design terms, a skeuomorph is when a new object imitates the visual characteristics of an older object, or even when those characteristics are no longer functionally necessary. Think about how early cars looked like horseless carriages. Think about how the save icon on your computer is still a floppy disk, even though basically nobody alive today has ever used one. Those are skeuomorphs. They carry the visual memory of something familiar into a new and unfamiliar context. Apple weaponized this concept in early iOS, and they did it on purpose, and they did it brilliantly. When you opened the Notes app on an original iPhone, you were not looking at a plain white text field with a blinking cursor. You were looking at a yellow legal pad, the kind you might find on a lawyer's desk. It had faint blue horizontal lines, that distinctive yellow parchment color, and the top edge was ripped slightly as if someone had torn off the previous sheet. The Contacts app looked like an actual leather-bound address book, complete with stitching along the spine. The calendar was dressed up to look like a desk calendar with a leather border at the top, the kind executives use to keep beside their telephones. Game Center, when it arrived, looked like a green felt poker table. Bookstore apps used actual wooden bookshelves. The voice recorder displayed a real microphone. The Compass app showed a physical compass face with a moving needle. None of this was accidental. Every single one of these design choices was a deliberate communication strategy. Think about who Apple was trying to reach with the original iPhone. This was not a product aimed at tech enthusiasts who already understood interfaces and digital systems. This was aimed at everyone: grandparents, small business owners, people who had never owned a smartphone and had no mental framework for what one even was. For those people, a blank interface with minimalist icons would have been terrifying, but a digital notepad that looked like a legal pad that they understood immediately. You write on it, you scroll through it, you tap it. The visual metaphor did all the teaching. This is the part that I think gets genuinely underappreciated when people talk about early iOS design. Skeuomorphism was not just an aesthetic choice, it was a pedagogical tool. It was Apple essentially saying, we know this is new and strange, so we are going to borrow the visual language of things you already know and trust. The bookshelf tells you to browse. The notepad tells you to write. The calendar tells you to tap dates. The leather stitching tells you this thing has substance. This thing is real. This thing is worthy of your trust. These were signals designed to reduce what designers call the learning curve, that initial wall of confusion that greets you every time you encounter something genuinely new. And here is where it gets really interesting. The man most associated with this design philosophy at Apple was not Steve Jobs, though he loved it. It was a designer named Scott Forstall. Forstall was the head of iOS software design, and he was famously passionate about skeuomorphic design. He believed that making digital tools feel tactile and familiar was not just practical, it was emotionally important. He understood, in a way that a lot of pure minimalists do not, that warmth and personality in an interface creates a sense of belonging. When your phone's notepad looked and felt like something you recognized, something you had a positive relationship with, it made the technology itself feel less alienating. And people loved it. Look at the nostalgia that surrounds early iOS design today. There are subreddits dedicated to it. There are YouTube channels that do nothing but restore old iPhones to their original iOS versions and document what it feels like to use them again. There is something that people describe when they use that software, something warm and tactile and almost comforting, that they struggle to articulate precisely because it is largely visual and emotional rather than functional. The apps had personality. Each one felt like a distinct little world with its own character. Opening the calculator felt different from opening the compass, which felt different from opening the Notes app, not just because they did different things, but because they looked and felt like different objects. Then 2013 happened, iOS 7 arrived, and Apple essentially burned the old world down overnight. Scott Forstall had been pushed out of Apple in 2012, and Jony Ive, the legendary industrial designer who gave us the iMac and the iPod and the aluminum MacBook, took over software design. And Jony Ive hated skeuomorphism. He found it tacky. He found it dishonest. Why should a digital interface pretend to be made of leather when it is not made of leather? Why should a bookshelf have wood grain when there is no wood anywhere inside this device? Yet to Ive, these visual lies were a kind of design cowardice, a failure to embrace what digital could actually be on its own terms. So iOS 7 went flat. The icons were redesigned with bold, simple color fields and clean vector graphics. The depth and texture disappeared. The leather stitching was gone. The legal pad was gone. The green felt poker table was gone. Everything became thin lines and translucency and a color palette that honestly looked like someone had just discovered Pantone. It was genuinely beautiful in its own way. It was also profoundly disorienting for millions of users. Apple's own support forums lit up with complaints. People who had used iPhones for years suddenly felt like they were holding a foreign object. Buttons that used to look like buttons now looked like suggestions. The visual depth that had guided the eye was replaced with flat planes that gave no hierarchy cues. And here is the dark part that nobody in the design industry wanted to say out loud at the time. The switch to flat design was not primarily driven by philosophy. It was driven by trend. The design world had been moving toward flat minimalism for years, influenced by Swiss design principles, influenced by Microsoft's Metro interface on Windows Phone, influenced by a general cultural fatigue with the visual busyness of skeuomorphic design. Apple was following a wave, not creating one. And because Apple did it, every other major platform followed immediately. Google's material design arrived shortly after. The entire visual language of digital interfaces pivoted hard toward minimalism and has stayed there ever since. So what did we lose? This is the question I genuinely want you to sit with, because I think we lost several things, and they are things that are difficult to quantify, but very real in their impact. We lost warmth. Skeuomorphic interfaces had a kind of coziness that flat design simply does not replicate. When your note-taking app looked like a real notebook, there was an intimacy to using it. You were not filling out a form, you were writing in a journal. That distinction matters for how we engage emotionally with what we create. We lost personality. Each app in early iOS had a distinct visual identity that went beyond functionality. Today, most apps look like variations on the same theme. Clean white backgrounds, thin gray dividers, circular profile images, blue text links. The homogeneity of modern interface design means that everything feels slightly like everything else. There is no texture, no character, no sense that a human being made a specific choice for a specific reason in a specific context. We lost legibility for beginners. This one has real consequences. Skeuomorphism was training wheels for the digital world, and we yanked the training wheels off before everyone had learned to balance. There are people, particularly older users, who found early iOS intuitive and find modern interfaces baffling. The visual cues that told them what was interactive, what was informational, what to tap and what to swipe, those cues relied on the physics of the real world. When the real world references disappeared, so did those cues. And I think we lost something even more fundamental than any of those three things. We lost the idea that technology should meet people where they are emotionally and cognitively, rather than demanding that people adapt to technology's own abstract logic. Skeuomorphism, at its best, was an act of empathy. It said, we understand that this is unfamiliar, and we are going to make it feel familiar until you are comfortable. Flat design says, here is the function, learn it. The subtext is not hostile, but it is definitely less warm. Now, I want to be careful here because I am not making a straight argument that skeuomorphism was better. It had real problems. At its worst, it was clunky and heavy and visually cluttered. Some of the design choices were garish or culturally dated almost immediately. What the green felt poker table in Game Center was genuinely silly. The faux wood bookshelf could feel patronizing after a while, and there is a legitimate philosophical argument that digital interfaces should look digital, should embrace the medium they actually exist in, rather than wearing the costume of another medium. But the point point is not that skeuomorphism was perfect. The point is that the conversation we should have had about replacing it never really happened. We did not collectively decide to move on from skeuomorphism because we had clearly outgrown it and were ready for something better. We moved on because designers and technology critics decided it was out of style, and then the rest of the world had to adapt to that decision without being consulted. The people who most benefited from skeuomorphic design, the people who were still learning, who were still using those visual bridges to make sense of digital space, those people did not get a vote. And I think there is a broader lesson in here about how the technology industry makes decisions generally. Features and design philosophies that are profoundly useful for regular people get retired when they become aesthetically unfashionable among the designers and tech writers who cover these products. The people setting the taste are not the same people who most depend on the results of those decisions. So next time you open an app on your phone and find it slightly cold, slightly confusing, slightly abstract in a way you cannot quite explain, maybe now you will have a name for what is missing. Somewhere in your pocket, underneath all the clean lines and thin fonts and flat color fields, there is a ghost of a yellow legal pad with blue lines, a leather address book, a wooden bookshelf full of digital spines. Those things served a purpose. They were bridges, and we burned them before everyone had crossed.